In the United States presidential election of 2016, Donald Trump contributed roughly $65 million of his own fortune towards campaign advertisement, while Hillary only spent a measly $14 million. I know what you're thinking. Boy, that's a lot of money. Should they really be able to spend that much? Well, this question was asked over 30 years ago when Buckley versus Valeo went to the Supreme Court. Argued in 1975 and decided in 76, Republican Senator James L. Buckley filed a lawsuit against U.S. Secretary of Senate Francis R. Valeo, stating that the Federal Election Campaign Act, or FECA, violated the First Amendment guarantee of freedom of speech. So, the question we're going to be looking at today, folks, is how the ruling of Buckley versus Valeo changed the U.S. political system to favor rich candidates and how much it has impacted society. Most of you remember Watergate best for the break-in at DNC offices at the now famous hotel and subsequent cover-up, but it was also a campaign finance scandal. 22 individuals and 17 corporations pleaded guilty to charges related to illegal corporate contributions to President Nixon's re-election committee and other campaigns. Outrage over these abuses fueled the 1974 FECA amendments, which imposed restrictions on the raising and spending of money in federal elections. However, Buckley found these regulations too strict and argued that campaign speech is free speech, so by limiting a candidate's ability to spend money, you limit one's constitutional right to speech. How dare you! In effect, the Berkeley Court ruled in the 5-4 landmark ruling is equivalent to free speech, meaning candidates can spend as much of their own money on their campaign as they see fit. Buckley versus Valeo is a critical case about campaign finance. Limit hard money, but individual candidates can give all they want. It's a good reminder that the First Amendment's right to free speech complicates any legislative effort to get money out of politics. Alrighty folks, here's an in-depth but simple look at what exactly the court found unconstitutional about the FECA, as some regulations were upheld and some were overturned. On the left lies the FECA, undisrupted by the ruling of Buckley versus Valeo. And on the right, you can see what the court considered a violation of the First Amendment. What was declared unconstitutional was placing a cap on how much candidates could spend on their own campaigns, which in 1976 was only $5,000. It's their money, they have the right to speak with it, and speech is not something that can or should be limited in the U.S. And the other part that the court found unconstitutional under the First Amendment was that candidates and independent groups had limits on their expenditures. That group, whether it be the NRA or any other, has a right to free speech and can spend as much money as they like. So basically, candidates can spend as much of their own money on their campaigns, and there are no expenditure limitations whatsoever. Big campaign contributions from corporations, on the other hand, could corrupt politicians. But hey, you can't corrupt yourself, right? Okay, on to politics. My favorite. Buckley versus Valeo is significant from having introduced the notion that spending money on behalf of a candidate or political party is a form of protected speech. It set the parameters of constitutionally permissible regulation of political campaigns in the United States for more than 3 decades. And as you can clearly see, this ruling had a trending impact on the U.S. political system. The rulings following Buckley versus Valeo also favor big money in politics. And predictably, candidate campaign spending has increased at an almost exponential rate since 1976. It seems like people just have more to say nowadays. And while you could claim that corporations are doing more, it's clear that more and more candidates are jumping into politics using their portrait fortune or never. In fact, I bet you didn't know 271 of the 533, over half the members of Congress are millionaires. Crazy. And from here, we can see that since the 1976 ruling of Buckley versus Valeo, campaign expenditures in the House and Senate have increased at a seemingly linear rate. If Valeo just managed to persuade one more member of the Supreme Court to vote against Buckley, this trend of favoring big money in politics could have potentially been avoided. But rest assured, Valeo was quite optimistic and didn't let the ruling faze him. Even in his book, Mike Mansfield, Majority Leader, A Different Kind of Senate, he states that future generations will be able to cope with events as they occur, no matter how rapidly. So no matter how messed up U.S. politics are, we'll be able to deal with them just fine, right? Moving on, Valeo reasoned that people may have a right to say what they want, but that doesn't necessarily mean they have a right to blast their speech as loudly as possible so that it drowns out others' voices. And with that, it's almost funny how vividly Valeo foresaw the backbone of our modern political era. Overall, many data claim that the Buckley Court's singular focus on fighting corruption misses the forest for the trees. Rules governing the use of money in politics must address the degree to which we allow wealthy individuals and interests to translate economic might into political strength. To protect core American values such as equal citizenship, democracy must write the rules for capitalism, not the other way around. However, even in the 21st century, Buckley would have to disagree, as in a passage from his book, Freedom at Risk, Reflections on Politics, Liberty, and the State, he states on page 244 that what people fail to appreciate is that the currency of corruption in elective office is not money, but vote. Okay, folks, let's get psychological. According to a 2012 study, the higher spending candidate is favored to win. Clearly, being wealthy is a huge advantage in politics and was something the Berkeley Court drastically overlooked. During the oral argument on November 10, 1975, Lord Archibald Cox said this in favor of Buckley.
First, I would say that in fact, individuals do not, just a matter of observation, spend large sums of money broadcasting their own speeches.
However, this does not mean the rich can simply buy their way into political office. I mean, we aren't that corrupt yet. In 2015, Bruce Rauner spent roughly $27.5 million of his own fortune to get elected governor of Illinois and raise millions more from a few wealthy families. But when it comes to affluent self-funders, Rauner's success is very much the exception rather than the rule. In fact, study after study has found that self-funders like Rauner have a really hard time winning, even if they spend millions upon millions. The failure of self-funders was particularly glaring in 2010, the year of the infamous Citizens United decision. Out of the 8 Senate and House candidates who spent the most of their own money on their campaigns, just one ended up winning. Meg Whitman, for instance, spent $144 million of her own money on an unsuccessful campaign for governor of California. Yikes. Reality is, if you just spend your own money, well, any rich person can do that. Indeed, a candidate's very willingness to spend millions and millions of his or her own money might be compensating for an inability to build a network of supporters or a lack of interest in doing that difficult work. Political scientist Jennifer Steen claims that, quote, a candidate's chance of winning in a primary or general election tends to decrease as the amount of personal funds invested in their campaign increases. Also, studies show that heavy self-funders tend to be less politically experienced than those who are among the more reliant on outside contributions. Beyond that, contributions highlight a candidate's ability to work with others and make connections, which voters like to see. Basically, if you raise a lot of money instead of simply spending your own, you look like a winner whose candidacy is catching among actual people. So overall, it seems that our political system is not all too pay to win, and that the ability to self-fund your entire campaign does not even remotely secure you place in office. However, being rich obviously still does help. Alrighty, we've thoroughly established that the ruling of Buckley versus Valeo greatly shifted the idealism of American politics to favor the wealthy, but let's look at what else lies beneath the cracks. Here's the opposing viewpoint towards the ruling. The Buckley court reached the conclusion that money has speech-like qualities, but as election law expert Daniel Takahi points out, the Supreme Court failed, quote, to reckon with the logical consequences of the fact that money is speech. If one accepts the proposition that money enables campaign-related speech, its corollary is that those without money lack the ability to speak. The Supreme Court did not acknowledge this reality, nor the severity of economic inequality in America, and since Buckley, this has only worsened. With the deck stacked in favor of disproportionately white donor class, candidates of color are less likely to run for office, and when they do, they raise less money than white candidates. The Buckley Court also perpetuated racial injustice in America. By expanding the First Amendment to include the right to spend money, the court enshrined existing property distributions as apolitical and legitimate. Alright, so what exactly is wrong with the limit? Many argue that whatever the relationship between money and electioneering, a spending limit does not actually limit people's freedom to speak or to express their views about a candidate or party. Spending limits apply evenly to all speakers, on the left, right, and center, and do not favor certain views over others. They are fair. They don't silence people who wish to express their views, but instead limit the amplification of speech. And even in the famous words of Valeo during a speech to the court in 1974, quote, and just as the volume of sound may be limited by law, so the volume of dollars may be limited without violating the First Amendment. So there you have it, folks, the full rundown of the 1976 ruling of Buckley versus Valeo. And well, to refer to our question regarding its impact on society, we can see that it launched the shift of American politics to favor the wealthy, which has left a trend of increased campaign spending. But we discovered that even though the higher spending candidate usually wins, this does not mean politicians can buy their way into office, as voters take a negative stance towards self-funders. However, on a darker note, the ruling has left poor Americans at a colossal disadvantage, which has further increased the wage gap in Congress. Yeah, no, this does not sound promising. I mean, even Buckley, during a word speech in 2000, claims the court's ruling were only, quote, at least half right. But don't worry, according to Buckley in an article for the National Review, 1974, quote, it is in the nature of a usual crisis to swell and then recede, to reach a climax and then be resolved. So we're crossing our fingers that it will fix itself out over time. But overall, thanks for watching, and hopefully you learned something.